My name is Marty Mascari. I'm with the North Central Texas Area Agency on Aging. I'm a contractor with them for the under the Area Agency on Aging for caregiver webinars such as we're doing today. And I also work with them on housing navigation under the Aging and Disability Resource Center. And today we're glad to have you to join us for our webinar, Pandemic, Grief, and Resiliency, which is a very hot topic. I apologize to all of you that were ready to go on August 11th. I had an unfortunate death in the family and had to reschedule, and I certainly apologize for having to do that. But here we are getting it done today, and again, still a very timely topic. If you could advance to the next slide, that would be great, Doctor. We're going to talk about continuing education. First of all, let me talk about asking questions. Because of the number of people we have on this webinar today, we have you all automatically muted as you come in. And we're going to leave it that way just because of the numbers. It's too cumbersome to try to be unmuting people to ask questions. And you cannot do that on your end. Under the webinar format, we would have to do that on our end. So please use the chat function or the Q&A function for your questions, and we'll try to get them answered sometime before we're done today. The other thing is I want you to know that we are recording this, and we will be sending out a recording to everyone who is registered in about a little over a week from now. Once we get it uploaded to YouTube and get the link, we'll send that out to you. You will receive a follow-up right after the session today, and I'm going to talk about that here right now. For those of you looking for continuing education units, we're providing complimentary CEU units for licensed social workers and licensed professional counselors in the state of Texas. If you need a certificate of attendance, we can provide that as well. But we're only set up in the state of Texas. I've had people tell me before they've been able to take the Texas certificates and use them in other states, but there's no guarantee of that. That is their decision. And so we don't have any control over that. But if you live in another state or you have a license in another state, you're more than welcome to get a certificate and see if that will work for you. We're providing 1.5 CEU credits today. In order to get the credits to qualify, you must complete the entire webinar live. So you've got to be on here for the full hour and a half. Our documentation comes out of a report we get back from Zoom once we're done, and it tells us how much time each participant has been on the webinar. And so we have to have that, and so you've got to stay on the live webinar. You're going to have to complete our Google evaluation. You're going to get 2 evaluations today. You're going to get our Google evaluation and an evaluation that Dr. Mottern will be talking about as we get into to his presentation. And we're going to ask you to complete both of those. They're both very short. They're not cumbersome, but we need, for different purposes, we need to have you complete both of those. I will have the links for both of those in the follow-up email I send to you about an hour or so after we finish today. The Google survey, which is the survey that's directly related to the CEUs, will be open and available to you until 5 p.m. Central Time on Friday. You're going to have to get that done by then, or it's going to come down, and that link will come down, and then we can't do it on a one-on-one basis after that. I just don't have the time to do that. So please complete it by 5 p.m. on Friday. Give us another week to get the certificates out to you. The certificates will be emailed to the email you put in the survey as you're completing the survey. I've had a lot of people put one email in for the registration, and then when they fill out the evaluation, they put a different email. We will use the email address that's in the evaluation form to send that to you. So that's all in regards to that. We'll go over that again at the end. But now I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Ron Mottern. He's with the Mottern Institute for Mind, Body, Wellness, and he's going to talk to us today about pandemic grief and resiliency. Doctor, it's all yours.
All right, thank you, Marty. Nice to be back once again. Today we do want to look at pandemic grief and resiliency. Before we get started, however, like Marty said, at the end of this presentation, there is a link to a survey there. Take 5 minutes to do that. That's about the average time that I see on the report. Anyway, it takes people to do it. If you would do that, please fill that out for me. Also, the questions I'll take those at the end of the presentation. So if I take them anywhere before then, I'm going to get off on a tangent, and we'll be here all day. Marty will be yelling at me to hurry up. So put them in the Q&A, put them in the chat if you would like, and then we'll get to them at the end when we finish. So this is sort of a timely topic, if you will, pandemic grief and resiliency. I was reminded also just of some other stuff I was doing here a minute ago. Included in this pandemic grief model that we're going to look at is parentally bereaved children. Now, I'm not. This is all I'm going to say about this. I'm not going to go into it as a part of this. But children who have lost parents due to COVID-19, the projections for that were that there would be 37,000 children who had lost parents by February of 21. And they were estimating that by the time we reached herd immunity, that there would be 117,000 children who had lost parents. So that's a lot of grief out there, especially among young people and what have you. But that fits into the pandemic grief category as well. We're going to spend a little bit of time looking at pandemic grief. What is that? And we're going to spend most of the time looking at the resiliency training. Pandemic grief, if you have it, then you know it, but what do I do about it, right? So I want to spend more time looking at the resiliency training as we go through, looking at those 4 different domains that we can make changes in to help us build some resiliency, help us to deal with that pandemic grief, because there's certain things we know about pandemic grief that set it apart from other types of grief outside of a pandemic. So I want to look at the cognitive domain, look at some cognitive restructuring and problem solving, the emotional domain, which includes social skills. Now, some of these things, some of us are very good at using. We use them all the time. Problem solving skills, for example, cognitive restructuring, social skills we may be adept at and what have you. Other times, not so much, right? So, so these are all a part of resiliency training, and we want to go over those. Physical domain, sleep, exercise, diet, of course, are very important in those. And then the spiritual domain, which is gratitude and spirituality. So we'll go over some stuff in those, okay? So let's look at pandemic grief. What is it? Well, pandemic grief is a type of dysfunctional grief due to a COVID-19 loss. Now, I wrote a wellness brief for the state. I also worked for the state disaster behavioral health service. When I put that in a wellness brief I wrote one time, and the social workers all went crazy, talking about, well, everybody grieves differently. How's this dysfunctional grief? Well, it's dysfunctional because it causes me dysfunction. That's what it is, right? Sure, everybody grieves differently and what have you, but if you're not having a problem with it, then it's probably not dysfunctional. But this is dysfunctional because it causes me problems, okay? Now, you'll see the reference there. These are the guys who did the original work, that Lee and Niemeyer, they're the ones who did the work on pandemic grief and what have you. So they're the ones to look at when you're looking for some references on that. But that, once again, that pandemic grief, not a traditional type of grief. Okay, this is not a normal grief that we have. There are other types of grief. for deaths occurring during the COVID-19 pandemic, but they're not due to COVID-19. If it's due to COVID-19, then we'd set it into the pandemic grief category. One of those is persistent complex bereavement disorder. Once again, it's defined as a maladaptive grief syndrome that's characterized by its prolonged and impairing nature. Okay, so very much like pandemic grief, okay, but not necessarily the death wasn't caused by COVID-19. Somebody died during the pandemic, but not due to COVID-19. Pandemic grief, like I said, is a little bit different from that. When we look at the characteristics for those, the persistent complex bereavement disorder is characterized by more of a yearning, while pandemic grief is characterized by apathy. And we'll look at the characteristics in a little more in just here in a second. So grief levels are higher after COVID-19 related death than non-COVID-19 related death. We know that as well. So that pandemic grief, we're looking at a very specific type of grief, grief due to a death caused by COVID-19. And that's different from other types of grief. There are other, once again, maladaptive types of grief, but pandemic grief is coming out as something that is have a lot of death because of the pandemic, and it's a specific kind of instance. It's not the same as grief suffered outside of a pandemic or grief caused by death that's not due to COVID-19 within a pandemic. So in order to measure this, what they did was they created the pandemic grief scale, and they took the 37 grief symptoms. 16 of those were from that persistent complex bereavement disorder inventory. And then they looked at 5 that were statistically significant for pandemic grief. And these are the 5 things that they found that really characterize the pandemic grief. One was suicidality. Now, that's we're going to have that anytime we have grief. That's going to be associated with that as well. But with the pandemic grief, also most certainly suicidality was there. Identity confusion. Okay, so people, who am I after the loss, right? How do I define myself as I go on? And many of you may work with people who are suffering from grief due to COVID-19. So really they'll fit in this category of pandemic grief. And so you'll see some of these things going on. So that identity confusion, reminiscing on the negative, okay? And that's the inability to recall positive memories of the deceased. All I can think about is the negative things. I can't think about any of the positive things of the deceased. So that pops up. That feeling of meaninglessness, I get all those syllables in there, also pops up. And then the characteristic one that sort of characterizes pandemic grief from other types is apathy, right? That apathy is, I just don't feel like doing anything about it, right? And this is one that I've seen quite a bit as well. It's that sort of apathy, right? I just don't care to do anything else. But those are the 5 ones that came up on the pandemic grief scale where they were measuring that. Suicidality, identity confusion, reminiscing on the negative, meaninglessness, and apathy. Okay. The scores on the pandemic grief scale were also associated with measures of complicated grief, depression, and lower resilience. So this already gives you an idea of, well, why are we looking at resilience on this? Because this is lower resilience is a measure associated with the pandemic grief. There was no relationship observed between the pandemic grief scores and health behaviors, so we ruled those out. And the results of further analysis indicated that mental health practitioners should focus on interventions to improve resilience, right? And perceived social support. So this is what we came up with in the research that told us that this is what we need to be looking at. So once again, that's the reason we want to look at resilience. You may say, why aren't you just looking at something like stress management or something like this? Well, what the research tells us is we need to be looking at resilience, okay, and also perceived social support. So that's what we're looking at. I just wanted to go through a couple of these studies here. Another thing on that brief I wrote for the state was they said, well, you only have a couple of studies on here. I was like, well, it's pandemic grief. It's only been around a couple of years. They can only do the research so quick, right? So, but there is more research coming out all the time, okay? In fact, there was a few more studies by the time I was putting this together than before I did the other one. So as a concept, it's gaining sort of traction as people see and look at this and say, well, this sort of accounts for what I'm seeing here. This sort of explains what's going on. That we know that, for example, that during a disaster, and this is certainly a disaster, this pandemic is certainly a disaster, that grief is felt more intensely during these times than it is outside of a disaster. So people may be experiencing grief in ways that they haven't before. And whether you're a person who's experiencing that grief, that's useful. That can be useful to know, right? May have dealt with loss before, but now it seems to be particularly intense and having a hard time getting over it and what have you. Well, that can explain that. If you're working with those people, that also may help to explain why people are having such a hard time with grief and what have you. But anyway, there's been other research. A Turkish version of the pandemic grief scale was done. It's, what we look at in these things is reliability and validity of the research. Does it translate to other situations and what have you? And what we're finding with the pandemic grief scale, all these things that have come up, is that it translates well. Like I said, there was a Turkish version, looked at a Spanish version in Peru, and what have you. All of those were valid studies. So the pandemic grief scale is something that we can use to look at and say, this pandemic grief thing is real. Okay, it's not something that's just imaginary. That the pandemic grief scale is real. Like I said, it's the research is not a whole lot of it out there right now, but it keeps getting more and more as we go on. If I looked at it today, because I did this last month, right? If I looked at it today, there might be another study or two in there about it, and I'm sure it would show it was valid as well, because these are different versions. It's a Turkish version, a Spanish version. So you have issues anytime you translate an instrument like that, but it seems to be coming out well. Okay, some of the findings they found from the pandemic grief scale in these different places was that although women tend to be at greater risk of developing grief and affective disorders, men scored higher on the pandemic grief scale. So that was interesting. And those people who were diagnosed with COVID-19 had a higher score on the pandemic grief scale than those who didn't. So the COVID-19 itself, the pandemic itself, is affecting scores on how we grieve and scores on the grief scale. Okay, all right. So that's about all we know about pandemic grief. Okay, which is enough to know that it's a more intense type of grief than other type of griefs. Grief. It's characterized especially by apathy. Probably going to affect men more than women. Not that it doesn't affect women, but men more than women, and what have you. So, and it's a real thing. We have the research out there that says that this is an actual construct we're seeing here. This isn't just something that somebody made up, and we're not seeing any evidence of it anywhere else. In fact, before we sort of had all of the research on that, as much research as we do, I would talk to people about pandemic grief who were sort of working in the field, and they'd say, well, yeah, that's right. We're seeing that more intense grief. People are having a harder time with it, trying to deal with it and process their way through the grief and what have you, especially as related to the loss to COVID-19, right? Once again, if I die of an auto accident during this time, my family's not going to have the pandemic grief, right? Because I didn't die of COVID-19. I just want to make sure that we get that straight. That would be, they may have persistent complex bereavement disorder or something like that, but not the pandemic grief. Okay, that's caused by death due to COVID-19. course, these days, if they tested me and I had COVID-19, even if I was in an auto accident, they'd probably relate it to that. But, but in reality, that wouldn't be it. So what do we do about this? What can we do? I mean, it's, you know, unfortunately, we lose people who are important to us in our lives all the time, right? And during the past couple of years, we may have lost somebody who is important to us as well, lost family members or what have you. And that's going to affect us, once again, like I said, in more intense ways, in different ways than it has in the past. So what do I do about that? How can I help myself move forward from this? And one of the ways is to work on resiliency. Okay. Well, what is resiliency? Well, resiliency is the ability to persist in the face of challenges, right? Or most of us think of resiliency as the ability to bounce back from adversity, right? So that's what we're talking about, our ability to bounce back. And what we see with pandemic grief is that characteristic thing of that is apathy, right? I don't care. I don't care anymore. I don't want to bounce back from it, right? Which makes resiliency all the more important to this, okay? So there are 4 different domains of resiliency that we generally talk about. Some people classify it a little different, but this is the general 4 different domains here. The cognitive domain, emotional, physical, and the spiritual domain. And we'll look at some skills in each one of those that we can use as we go through. So the cognitive domain, okay. The things we want to look at is doing some cognitive restructuring. That includes a CPR. I call it a cognitive phenomenological report, because phenomenological means sort of in the moment. And that's when we want to do the report. You can think of it as a cognitive patterns report as well, looking at the patterns in my thinking. We'll look at thinking traps. Okay, these are cognitive distortions that they're thinking errors. I really like the name thinking traps because when I think of it, I think of a big bear trap. And when I get myself in one of those thinking traps, that's just what happens. It's got me, and I oftentimes have a very difficult time getting out of that thinking trap. We'll look at some beliefs as well. Energy management is a part of cognitive domain, as well as problem-solving skills. Now, like I said, most people may do very good at all of these. Some of us may be better at others of them than we are at others of them. And then, you know, some of us probably need a little help with all of them. Okay. So, for example, under some of the things that we have there, over the years when I've taught them, when people come in, they say, oh yeah, I know how to do that. I know how to do that. And so you ask them to do it and they don't know how to do it, right? So as we look at these, okay, let's look at a cognitive patterns report, okay? This is in that cognitive domain once again. And I just write these things down, right? I just write this down on a piece of paper. I write down 4 things: situation, thoughts, feelings, and beliefs. Now, this is from a strict cognitive perspective. There are other people who do this a little bit differently. REBT, Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, approaches this. All of these things are in there. They call them something a little bit different. They approach it in a little different manner. This is a more strict cognitive method. But when I talk about the situation, when I write down that situation, okay, and you can do this right now if you'd like. You have a situation, you can write that down on a piece of paper and just go through these. I encourage you to do that. But whatever I write down needs to be brief, and it needs to be objective, okay? And because it needs to be objective, that means that it's one of the most difficult parts often of doing a CPR, okay? Of course, objective means, you know, it's like a photograph, like a tape recording. You know, if it's a photograph, we can look at it and we can all agree, yes, this is what the photograph shows. Tape recording, we can listen to it and say, yeah, everybody says, yes, that's what was said. Subjective, objective is the opposite of subjective. Subjective is my opinion, right? And we all know what those are like. So we want to stay away from those. But the situation needs to be brief and it needs to be objective, okay? The problem with the objectivity is that even though I do a CPR, or we just call them thinking reports as well, even though I do a thinking report for myself, I still like to think that I'm in the right in this. And if I write a situation objectively, then it's not always so obvious that I was in the right. Okay, so people have a hard time writing these objectively sometimes. Okay. The next part is I want to write my thoughts. We've got 50 to 70,000 thoughts going through our heads every single day. And how many of them do we pay attention to? Usually not many, right? We don't spend a whole lot of time on metacognition, on thinking about our thinking. Okay, we're always thinking and we just act on it, but we don't stop and think about our thinking. Gee, what was I thinking when I did that? What was going on in my head when I had this feeling? What was going on? We don't do that, right? We feel these things, we think these things, then we act on them. So really the meat of this CPR, the heart of the thinking report, is getting at what is going on inside my head. And that's the little self-talk I've got going, right? That's the little self-talk. I want to pay attention to that little self-talk in my head. I want to write down all of them because I don't know what's important until I start writing down all of them. There may be just a small little thought that's causing me some problems, and I just dismiss it because I think it's irrelevant, and I never get to solve my problem because that was it. Okay, so the big ones, I'm usually pretty good at picking out the big ones, right? Yeah, okay, well, that was a thinking error. I probably didn't need to be thinking that. I could change that. But it's the little ones that get us. So write down all of the thinking, and I write them down exactly as I hear them. Okay, so if I'm using foul language to myself in my head, then I need to write it down that way, right? If you're not, don't write it that way. But if you are, then write it that way because that is what I need to pay attention to, okay? I'm looking for the thoughts that are causing me risk in my life, okay? That are causing me to act a certain way. For example, just say, well, what do we look at this for? Well, for example, if I had someone in private practice who had pandemic grief, who had lost a loved one or what have you to COVID-19, we may very well do some CPRs. We may very well do some thinking reports. And, part of the situation is that, my alarm clock went off this morning and I didn't get up and go to work. Okay. And then I write down all the thoughts that go with that. Okay. So here we're starting to deal with that characteristic perhaps of apathy, right, of the pandemic grief. I don't care about anything anymore, right? I don't care about getting up and going to work anymore or doing anything, okay? So that behavior of laying in bed needs to change, otherwise I'm going to get fired, right? Now these days, people are having such a hard time finding people to go to work. It may take more than this to get you fired, but sooner or later it probably will. But so I have to look at all of those thoughts. And I have to identify the thought that is keeping me laying there in bed. It could be something like, what's the point? We're all going to die. What's the point of this? I don't care. What I had to live for is gone, right? Whatever it happens to be. Those are just some examples, right? I have to pay attention to that thinking. Write that stuff down exactly as I hear it in my head. Because if I don't write it down exactly as I hear it, I'm not going to catch myself thinking it in the future. And that's what I want to do. I want to catch myself thinking it so I can change it. Okay. So if I identify in that situation, if I identify that, what does it matter as a risky thought for myself, then that's one I'm going to pay attention to. And the next time I have the thought, well, what does it matter? Then I would say, wait a minute. That's sort of a risky thought. That keeps me laying in bed and almost got me fired the other day. Maybe I need to change that, work on changing that thinking so my behavior can be different, okay? We want to look at feelings. And when we talk about feelings, we're generally talking about emotions. Remember, my emotions are caused by my thinking, okay? My emotions are caused by my thinking. So the feelings just act as a double check on the thinking. Sometimes I'm more aware of what I'm feeling than what's going on inside my head, especially when I start these reports. So I may be feeling, I may recognize that I'm feeling apathetic, right? So what's the thought that's making me feel this apathy that I'm going through and what have you, okay? And then we get to the beliefs, which is the thinking behind the thinking. The thoughts are the little self-talk I got going inside my head. The beliefs are below that. The beliefs are unconscious, okay? So I'm not going to be hearing those, hearing myself say those to myself inside my head. But the beliefs ultimately are where we want to get to on this, okay? So cognitive patterns report, okay, I have one here. There we go. I told my partner that I was feeling depressed. She said it would pass. I should just get up and get on with my life. Oh my goodness. And then we have all those, then we have all those thoughts in my head. I've got some feelings there, some emotions. And then I've got the beliefs. And this is what the beliefs, anytime I catch myself saying should or ought, especially must, then I'm probably on the trail of a belief, okay? So I have my belief I should be able to take care of my family. I shouldn't show weakness. People should care for me, okay? Now you'll notice that there's really nothing wrong with those beliefs, right? I mean, I wouldn't pick out one of those and say that's particularly wrong. However, we're not looking for right and wrong here, okay? We're looking for, does this thinking cause me problems in my life? And this I should not show weakness is preventing me from taking care of my, going and seeing somebody, taking care of my depression and getting on with my life. Okay, but I don't want to do that. I want to admit that I've got a problem, right? And we see this all the time. And the place we see this the most is with emergency responders, right? They don't want to talk to anybody but other emergency responders, which is great. That's fine that you do whatever you need to do, but there's probably going to come a point when your peer, his skills at dealing with whatever you're dealing with are going to run out, right? So you're going to need to talk to somebody else about that. So this I shouldn't show weakness, and talking to somebody else is going to show weakness, and they don't understand me, and yada, yada, yada. Okay. These beliefs are what we want to get to. Once again, we're not looking for good and bad. We're looking for, is this risky for me? Okay. And it's risky for me if because of this belief, I end up doing something that hurts me and hurts my family, right? Okay. All right. Okay. So yeah, so this is the first part. Cognitive restructuring has 3 parts. Step number 1 is pay attention to my thoughts and feelings. That's this right here. Once I get that done, I've finished with step 1. Okay. Step 2 is to recognize the risk in my thoughts and feelings. Okay. What is it there that's caused me some risk in my life? So I go through and just underline those or mark them however I want to, right? If I'm putting them on the computer, I can do them in a different color, or I do them in red. And identify, what are those risky thoughts? What are the risky feelings? What are the risky beliefs? Once again, not bad beliefs, not looking at good and bad, but risky beliefs. So we do those, we look at those, that stuff. And then we do step number 3, which is to replace the risk thinking with more thinking, right? I want to replace that risk thinking with new thinking. So that thought, just picking one out there, she doesn't care to see what's going on with me. Well, wait a minute. Well, I mean, is that true? I mean, this is my partner, right? She's cared for me, and is it true that she doesn't really care to see this? Well, probably not, right? It's probably not true. You know, maybe it scares her too to see me this way because she's never seen me this way before, right? Or maybe I'm being a little bit sensitive because of this, and I'm not giving her credit for all the times she has shown in the past that she has been with me and what have you. Whatever new thought works for me, right? That corrects that risk in there. That's what I want to use, okay? And I'll do the same thing with the beliefs when I get to those. I should not show weakness. Maybe, you know, the thing about a belief is we can't flip it, right? Thinking I can flip, right? I can change she doesn't care to see this going on to, well, she does care to see it going on. I can do that. I cannot do something like I should not show weakness into I should show weakness. I can't do that. And I'm not sure that I'd want to anyway, okay? But I should not show weakness in there, I have to modify it. Okay, I have to change it in some way to reduce that risk. You know, the Greeks, when the Greeks invented this, the Stoics actually invented this. Okay, the Greeks used to call thinking, these thoughts up here, fantasia, right? It's a fantasy. It's what a fantasy is, just a thought, right? They used to call that fantasia. However, beliefs, they called fantasia cataleptica, okay? Fixed thoughts. So thinking is like the wind, right? Where beliefs are more like rock. Now, you can, however, rock can be shaped by the wind, right? If you've ever been to some of our state parks and what have you, up in Utah, or where you can see how the wind over time shapes those rocks into magnificent shapes and what have you. So that's what we're doing with our thinking ultimately, is we're going to be changing our, modifying our belief system as we go along. Okay. All right. Okay. Now thinking traps. This is what I like this, because that's exactly how I think about thinking traps. It's a big bear trap, right? That keeps me stuck. Once it gets me, it keeps me stuck where I am. And if I want to use this resiliency, if I want to move out of where I am, then I'm going to have to also get out of these thinking traps. Sorry about that. I was looking at my time. So I get on this stuff, Marty, and I just keep going. So I'll try to finish on time. I'll speed it up here. So thinking traps, and then we have the corrections to those. So these are some of the things we want to catch ourselves in, right? Closed-mindedness, all or nothing thinking, overgeneralization. These are classic thinking errors, right? Jumping to conclusions, right? Discounting the positive, catastrophizing. Emotional reasoning, okay, is one that's been around a long, all these have been around a long time. Victim stance, personalization is blame, power thrust is especially, it seems right now, is a big one. And instant gratification, that one also, I don't know if it's just due to COVID now. It's what I see on the road, right? Power thrust and instant gratification. Seems that everybody's driving faster and they're driving much more aggressively, right? So I see these on the road every time I get on there, and I try to stay off as much as possible. But then we have the corrections for those. So just straight across from them is the correction for them. So closed-minded is corrected by being open-minded, right? All or nothing thinking is also called black and white thinking. Gray thinking, right? What's in between the two poles on that? Overgeneralization, just stick to the facts, okay? Mental filter, meaning I'm filtering things that are coming in. I usually filter out the positive things and just focus on the negative things, which is very similar to discounting the positive, right? The correction for both of those is to focus on the positive. That jumping to conclusions, if this, then this must be what's going on, right? Well, maybe not. There are other possibilities, right? The Native American rule of 6 is a wonderful tool to use, that for any situation, there are at least 6 different ways of looking at it, right? Doesn't have to be that. I don't have to jump to that conclusion, because there are at least 5 other ways, probably 50 other ways, but at least 5 other ways of me looking at that situation. So catastrophizing, once again, stick to the facts. Don't just focus on the bad. These are just the bad things that are going to happen. Focus on the facts and what's actually going on. Emotional reasoning is corrected by deciding on facts, not feelings. Think we got a problem with that in our society today? Okay. Have I offended anybody yet as we've moved on here? Possibly, right? Because people get offended by everything, okay, as we go on. So that emotional reasoning, to avoid that myself, we'll decide what's the facts on this, not what I feel about it, right? Just because I feel a certain way about it doesn't mean one thing or the other, right? I may not like it, but this is the way it is, okay? Part of my, over the years, for the 20 years I've been doing this, a large part of that has been working with correctional populations who have a problem, a severe problem with these thinking errors that go on. But I remember I was I think I was in Anderson County Jail in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, or close to Oak Ridge, anyway, Anderson County Jail. I was teaching a class there, and we were going over this was going over the decide on facts, not feelings, and the captain walked in from the, who was over the COs, and he said, Dr. Mottern, thank you for finally explaining to them that, that just because they want things a certain way doesn't mean they are a certain way, right? I think he was being a little bit facetious as he went through there, but that was what we were working on. And that's what we have problems with when we're in emotional reasoning, right? Is that I don't like this and it shouldn't be that way. And that's what I'm going to make a decision on, what I think it should be, rather than what it is, okay? So in any way, so we don't want to do that. Victim role, victim stance, focus on what's my responsibility in this, right? Personalization and blame, taking things personally and blaming others because of it. Once again, stick to the facts. What are the facts of the situation? Power thrust, letting go of control, corrects that, which if you're in power thrust, and I have to admit that that's, that's one of my favorite thinking traps to get in. There's nothing more difficult in the world than to let go of control, right? You want to squeeze that handful of sand, and the more you squeeze it, the more it leaks out. Instead of if you just hold it open, then you'll hold what you have. So letting go of control is, I mean, whatever your favorite thinking trap is, the correction is going to be very difficult to do, right? But we need to do that in order to build this resilience, right? I have to let go of these things. I can't get stuck in this thinking trap and not move forward. So instant gratification, once again, the bane of our age, right? Even before the pandemic. But the Stoics also used to use something, Epictetus, the famous Roman Stoic, something called holding on and holding off, right? So holding on would be, when I want to give up, I hold on to it. I don't let go of it. You can practice that by taking a cold shower, okay? Take cold showers and stay in it for a little while. Practice holding on. Holding off is the opposite, right? I want to do something, but I don't do it, okay? Don't scratch that itch you have, okay? You've been out this summer, you got some chiggers, that's, those are horrible, right? But don't scratch, right? Don't scratch them. That's something, right? Or any scratching, you get an itch, then don't scratch it, right? That would be holding on. It's a simple way to practice these things, right? One of the biggest things that I've encountered in my private practice in the pandemic is anger, right? People are getting more angrier and angrier. They're getting more frustrated. I don't know how many people have told me, anger is starting to become a problem for me. I need to work on that. I've caught myself being frustrated about things as we've gone through all of this stuff. So that sort of holding on and holding off is a good practice in many different ways. Okay, let's see. Sorry about that. Okay, let's go just in a couple of these. Closed-minded error. One practice for that, if I want to work on it, would be to review my thinking over the past several days, right? Identify a time when you were closed-minded, and then write down when you used it. Who did you use it with? What happened, right? So you just write that down on a piece of paper. And then if I was going to move out of closed-mindedness and move into open-mindedness, how would I deal with that? How would I deal with each of those things, right? So how would I deal with the closed thinking? That what's a way that I could have been more open-minded in this situation, right? So that's what I want to do, and you do that pretty much for each of those. So catastrophizing, right? I take a minor situation and I turn it into a major situation. I make a mountain out of a molehill, right? That's catastrophizing. Okay, so there's an example there. If you get the PowerPoint to this, the slides to the PowerPoint that Marty has for you, you can look at all of these as we go through. But that one, I want to do the same thing, right? When's the last time I used this thinking here? Who did I use it with? And then what happened? Just write that down and then go back and look at that and say, well, what's really the facts of the situation, right? Is this really true? You know, if something is, this is the worst, you know, or what have you. Well, is it really the worst? Is this the worst it could ever have been? Right? You want to intervene on that. You want to confront that and just sort of ask yourself, is this really the worst that things have ever been? Right? Does nobody really care? Right? Does my wife not really care because I'm depressed? Is that true? Does that make a whole lot of sense? Really? So you want to review those, and that's what you want to do for each of those thinking errors as you go through. Discounting the positive, once again, same thing. Okay, review the thinking. When did I use this thinking error? With whom? It's the same skill, right? We're using the same skill. This is how I correct it, right? And then say, how do I move out of this? If I want to move out of this, if I want to move out of this, thinking error, then how do I do that? How do I need to change my thinking, okay, as I go forward? So that one as well. And now beliefs. So we'll look a little bit about beliefs here. Okay, remember beliefs, that we have that old picture of the iceberg and what have you. Beliefs are ultimately my problem as far as my thinking goes, right? Because I can change my thinking anytime I want to. I can change my thinking in any situation to move out of that situation, okay? And at the time that I'm doing it, I can change and just move out of it. The problem is unless I change the belief, I'm going to keep having that situation pop up over and over and over again. And there's going to reach a time where I'm not interested in changing it, and I'm going to act on the risk, right? But remember that the beliefs are like the bottom of that iceberg, right? That they're the major part, that unconscious part of the mind there. So this is sort of what from rational emotive behavior therapy, right? They use the ABCs. Now they're up to the E's. Okay, actually, I think they have an F in there these days as well. But this is as far as I learned it, right? So they have what's called, and they just write on a paper, A, B, C, D, E, right? Just like, and it's a thinking report, just like the other cognitive report that we use, okay? So they write down, what was the activating event? That's the situation, right? What happened, okay? Then they write down the beliefs, and they're calling beliefs, they're calling thoughts beliefs. We make a distinction between them. They don't. So when they say belief, they're just talking about any thinking that goes on, whether it's a thought or whether it's a belief, what we would call a belief. Okay. So during that situation, during that activating event, what was I thinking about? What was the thinking that was going on, right? What's the beliefs there? And then what was the consequence of it, right? So as I look at this, what was the consequence of this belief that I have when this event occurred? Now I look at the disputing belief. So how do I change that thinking, right? So once again, we're going back, changing the thinking and applying effective new thinking as I go forward. So this is the same thing as that strict cognitive thinking report that we did, but this approaches it in a little different way. So once again, it's the same thing, right? This is using the ABCs instead of the situation, thoughts, feelings, and beliefs. But and here you see it in the red and the green, right? So what was the consequence? I feel angry. I feel depressed. I feel apathetic. I feel suicidal, right? As we're looking at pandemic grief and how to move out of that. So I have these thoughts. I have these feelings going on, okay? And so how do I dispute those? Well, what I'm disputing is the thinking, right? Nobody understands me. Well, they can't understand me if I don't talk to them and explain to them what's going on, right? She doesn't care to see what's going on. Well, she's busy taking care of everybody else right now because I'm not doing that job, so she's preoccupied, right? So thinking of what is the new thinking that I can use to get myself out of this? I should be providing for my family. Well, can't pour from an empty cup, right? I have to be able to take care of myself before I can take care of other people, okay? So once again, using this new thinking to move forward, okay? What's the effective new belief? So these are some new beliefs when we look at that. I should be able to take care of my family. Once again, I can't pour from an empty cup, right? I have to take care of them. I have to take care of me so I can take care of them, right? I shouldn't show weakness. Well, only by admitting weakness can I do something to overcome it. So I I can't just pretend like it doesn't exist and actually conquer it, right? So I have to admit it before I can overcome it. And then people should care for me. Well, sometimes people have to take care of themselves, just like I have to take care of myself, right? So I should take care of other people. Other people should take care of me. We should take care of each other, right? So this is what we see. And this is often a thought that with the pandemic, grief may be particularly important, because remember, we also have to, that part of that resilience is that social connectedness, right? I have to have some sort of social connectedness. And if I'm apathetic, and if I'm just staying in the house by myself and I don't want to go out and I don't want to talk to anybody, that's a problem for me. Those thoughts are risky for me. That behavior is risky for me. They are caused by the thoughts. So I have to do something about them. So this is where we would use that. This is why that's important for us. Okay. Okay. All right. So energy management. Now, when we're talking about energy management in this, we're talking about these skills that we have. We've covered some of these skills before in other presentations that we've done here. Skills like diaphragmatic breathing, also called squared breathing by some people, EFT. And those are the two things that if anybody comes to see me for, well, they come to see me for just about anything, especially stress management, but just about anything else, those two things are going on there. All of these are part of evidence-based practice. We know they work. We know they relieve stress. We know they help us to, and once we relieve stress, we know we can think better about different things, okay? So mindfulness meditation, it doesn't have to be MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction. Any sort of mindfulness meditation should be useful for you. Guided visualization, progressive muscle relaxation, and all of this stuff you can find on YouTube, right? Where do I go to find this? YouTube. YouTube is your friend, okay? YouTube is your stress friend, or YouTube is your grief friend. It'll help you to find these skills that I want to engage in that are going to help me. For example, the diaphragmatic breathing. When we do diaphragmatic breathing, we're not really interested in the diaphragm other than the fact that it is stimulating the vagus nerve, okay? Vagus nerve is that 10th cranial nerve, runs out of our brain, connects all the major organs in the body. 90% of the serotonin that we have in our body is contained in our gut, okay? So through that vagal nerve stimulation, the vagus nerve becomes stimulated, moves that serotonin up the gut-brain axis into the brain where it can work. So that vagal nerve stimulation causes the release of serotonins, okay? Those are your Prozac type drugs, right? Melatonins, Ambien type drugs, and endorphins. Those are your morphine type drugs. So that's the reason we want to use diaphragmatic breathing, is to stimulate the vagus nerve. There are other things we can do to stimulate the vagus nerve, but this is one of the most simple ones that we have. We're always able to breathe, right? Wherever we are, we don't have to have any special equipment, nothing of that nature. So when we talk about the energy management, these are things we want to practice to help us move forward. And these are just a small part of it, right? Don't think that for resiliency, all I have to do is these skills. I need to do these skills, but these I also have to work on the cognitive restructuring stuff, because if I find myself, especially in pandemic grief, I'm going to have those thoughts. Suicidality, I'm going to have those thoughts of who am I now that this other person is gone, right? I'm going to have those sorts of thoughts that I'm going to have to resolve, okay? I have to resolve these thoughts. And while I'm doing that, then I want to use these energy management things to move me forward. So guided visualization, progressive muscle relaxation, look it up on YouTube, type in guided visualization. You'll have, 1,000 different guided visualization exercises there at your disposal. Same thing for mindfulness meditation, progressive muscle relaxation. If you do the EFT on YouTube, you'll probably come up with Nick Ortner or somebody like that who has specific ones who guide you through the tapping techniques. So you just follow them, and as you go through that, and you can do those. They even have some things for some diaphragmatic breathing on there as well. So energy management, it's an essential part of the resiliency, but it also is something that it's not the whole part of it, right? I'm going to have to do some of the other cognitive stuff as well. Problem solving, that's something else that I want to do. I'm particularly fond of the WBEP problem solving module. That's wants, behavior, evaluation, planning. Okay, these are also known as the procedures that lead to change. If you're familiar with reality therapy and choice theory, that's where this comes from. So the wants, I ask myself the question, what do you want? Okay. For the behavior, in reality therapy, you'll see this as a D for doing. But most of the people I talk to, when I say, what are you doing? They say, well, I'm changing my thinking. Right? No, that's not what we're talking about. What's the behavior? So we just change it to a behavior. What are you doing to get what you want? Then is what I'm doing getting me closer to what I want in a way that doesn't hurt me or others? If it's not getting me closer to what I want, then it's a bad choice. If it's getting me closer but it hurts me or others, then it's also a bad choice. So I need to go back and look at something else, come up with what's my plan on this. Okay, so very simple little rubric. Okay, wants, behavior, evaluation, planning. What do you want? What are you doing to get what you want? Is what you're doing getting you closer in a way that doesn't hurt you or others? So what's your plan? If it is getting me closer, if it's not hurting anybody else, my plan is to keep it up, right? And like I said, to most of us, these things seem very simple, right? But when I get myself in a situation of loss, of grief, of extreme stress or trauma or anything like this, these simple skills can sometimes become very difficult. Okay, very difficult for me to use, and for some people, they just never learned them. Like I said, I worked with correctional clients for the last 20 years, and if we want to help correctional clients, for the most part, unless they're a psychopath, what we do is we teach them these things. A major part of which is resilience, because they never learned these things. Most of us learned these things as we were growing up, right? They seem second nature to us. They didn't, okay? So we know that if we want to reduce recidivism and things of that sort, then we need to teach them these skills that we picked up, but they didn't get. But in situations like pandemic grief, where we have an intense sort of grief, okay? We have these characteristic things like apathy, right? And questioning who I am and what this all means, and suicidality and what have you. I may not be the best at remembering that I have these skills, right? So I may be thinking that maybe that suicidality is a good idea, and need to call that suicide hotline or call somebody to talk about what's going on. But a lot of other things, right, are going on during this that I forget these skills, and I really just need to sort of brush them off and, blow the dust off of them and move forward with them as I go. Along with the problem solving, we use the Samick action planning model. Others use SMART, right? Simple, measurable, action-oriented, realistic, and time-sensitive. Samick is one we use in reality therapy. Simple, attainable, measurable, immediate, consistent, and within my control, right? It's not within my control. It's not my plan. That's one where oftentimes clients have a very difficult time with. Well, this is what needs to happen. Okay, how much control do you have over that? None. Okay, all right, so not a good idea, right? Not a good plan. Let's go back, let's make another plan, because I don't have any control over that. Okay, no matter how much control I want to have, if I have no control over it, it's not going to do me any good. Okay, moving on to the emotional domain. This is where you really look at the social skills, and these are some of the social skills. Once again, most of us learn these things growing up, and how to use these more or less. Emotional, they have what's called EQ these days, right? And we still have IQ, which is intellectual quotient, right? But now we have EQ, which is emotional quotient. And that's as important as IQ is in anything, and perhaps more so, okay? In order to develop that emotional skill, that emotional quotient and what have you. These are some of the things we have to be able to do. And these are some of the things that I ask people, active listening, for example, right? Oh yeah, I know how to active listening. And okay, but demonstrate that for me. And they demonstrate that they don't know that at all. Understanding and responding to the feelings of others. That is empathy. That is one that, oh yeah, I know how to do that. I'll, demonstrate it and for me, demonstrate it for me. Gee, not empathy, right? Not empathy at all. So sometimes I just need to review those. Once again, we have the arousal control skill. This is the empathy one, right? Just a note on that one: never ever tell anybody else what they're feeling. Okay, so you're feeling this way. No. Okay, you seem to be feeling upset right now. You can do that, but don't, sort of a question. Well, you seem like you're feeling this way. Don't ever tell anybody what they're feeling. Okay, that doesn't work out well. Now, if you say something like, well, you seem to be feeling upset right now, if you get that right, yes, that's exactly right, I feel upset. And if you get it wrong, they'll tell you, no, that is not what I'm feeling right now. I'm feeling something else. And of course, we've all experienced that, right? We've all gone through that. But the skill of it, the skill of using empathy, is just to not do that in the first place, right? Is to try to get it right, to observe other people and what they are saying, what they're doing, and then from that, try to figure out what it is they're feeling, and then sort of query that, right? Well, it looks like you're sort of feeling upset right now. Is that right? Yes, or whatever it happens to be, whatever the emotion happens to be, right? How to ask for help is one. Many people have a problem with asking for help. And when you role play it with clients or something like that, boy, they just don't know how to do it. They just have a problem. And so there's a skill for it, right? How to ask for help. Oftentimes we have that problem ourselves, right? And I'm not sure how to ask for help in this situation, right? I mean, it may not be an overall thing, but I'm not sure in this situation exactly how I need to do that. We have a skill for that, okay? We have a skill for how to offer help, okay? Oftentimes, people would be more willing to accept help if how they were offered it wasn't as abrasive as sometimes it is, right? So if we want to help other people, then changing our behavior to look at how I can offer that in a way, in that warm, sincere manner that I can offer help to other people, that they're more willing to accept it. And once again, most of us learn these things, but when we're under intense stress and things like that, remember, intense stress, actually long-term chronic stress atrophies the brain structures, right? Excuse me. So we can forget some of these things, okay? So just reviewing them and making sure I'm up with it. Assertiveness skill is one that few people know how to use. Most of the time we end up being aggressive instead of using that assertiveness skill of I feel and I need you to do this, right? When you do this, when you do whatever it is, I fill that in. And this is what I need you to do. Now, it's not incumbent upon the other person. They don't have to do it if they don't want to. And you're not making them do it, right? Because we would never do that in reality therapy, okay? But you're saying, this is what I'd like to have happen, right? When you do this, this makes me feel this way. And I would appreciate it if you would do something else, right? So that assertiveness skill is a very useful skill that we can use in our lives. Yeah, there we go. When you speak in a loud voice to me, I feel frightened and think you're trying to control me, and I need you to speak softer when you talk to me, right? So once again, it's neither passive nor aggressive, right? It's just giving the other person information, okay? And that's really all that we can do anyway. Okay, that physical domain, 7 to 8 hours sleep a day, 7 to 9 perhaps for adults. That is very important that we get that. It's important that we get that good sleep. It's important that we get REM sleep, that rapid eye movement sleep, that dream sleep, because that's where the unconscious works out all its problems, okay? This is what happens with cases like PTSD and trauma and things of that nature. When I don't get that restful sleep that I need, that REM sleep that I need, I can't like the brain doesn't get to work it out. So I have a very difficult time letting go of things. Now, we don't ever have 7 to 8 hours of REM sleep. REM sleep is just a few minutes long, right? But we need to move into that. We need to get that. If you don't get that REM sleep, if you don't get enough of it, then that is one thing that you will go psychotic. Okay, and that's not good. That's psychotic is crazy, right? So we don't want to do that. Exercise, talk to your primary care physician about your health, about that, but try to get some, right? Get outdoors if you can do that, walk, do something of that nature, get some aerobic exercise as well. Try to spend time in green space, things like that. We know that those are good for us as well. This helps boost our resilience, okay? Diet, watch your food intake. Remember that when we get stressed, okay, the biggest stress that we historically have had in our development is famine. So the body starts to do things like produce cortisol, which makes us put on fat because it wants to help us live through that famine that's not there, okay? But we're stressed because of work. We were stressed because of famine, okay? So we don't need to put on weight, but the body hasn't caught up with it yet, okay? So lots of things like that. Not only do we want to eat more, we want to eat compulsively, but we also want to eat high calorie foods. We don't want to exercise because exercise makes us burn off fat instead of store fat, and the same thing for sleep. It will shorten the sleep cycle. So physical domain, make sure you get those things. Spiritual domain, just to sort of wrap up, gratitude, okay, is a good one for this, gratitude. We can do that in several different ways. One is just to write a thank you note to people, okay? If I can't write a thank you note physically, then just write them mentally, right? Just thank someone mentally for what they've done for you, right? Keep a gratitude journal, make it a habit to write down or share with a loved one thoughts about the gifts you've received each day, okay? Count your blessings, okay? Pray. If you're a religious person, you can pray, you can meditate, okay? Meditation, that mindfulness meditation is just focusing on the present moment, right? That's all that I'm thinking about there. Sometimes we have what's called mantra meditation, or it's called holy word meditation, and some of the research and what have you. It may be just focusing on a word or repeating a word over and over. So like peace, right? So I just stop and I just say peace, 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 just over and over again to myself as I'm doing that, just focusing on that particular word. So that's how I sort of work on my gratitude to develop that resilience in my life, okay? All right, okay. I thought I had one more on there, gratitude and what else? Spirituality, spirituality. I guess I didn't put a slide in there. So the spirituality, if you find yourself to be a spiritual person, then practice that spirituality, whatever form that may be. Maybe just praying and meditating. Maybe that's good enough for you. If you belong to a religious group, a church, or something like that, certainly spending time with those people, you know, as a community and what have you, is also going to be good for you. Okay. All right. So that's it. There's the survey. If you'll fill that out at some point in the future. There's also some references on there for you. There's the continuation thing. Okay. So
that's great stuff. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hey, there was one up here just a minute ago in the chat that I want to make sure we get to, if we could, and I'll try to read it to you if I get back to it. I apologize, we bounced back there a little bit. Somebody asked about
there we are.
What part does cognitive dissonance play for those that discount the pandemic? I'm sorry, it just jumped on me. Discount the pandemic politicize the pandemic, hold to conspiracy theory, anti-vaccinations, masking, and the experience pandemic grief. How do we help? And if you want to read that, it's in the chat. You'll be doing that again.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at it from a cognitive dissonance sort of standpoint, cognitive dissonance is an interesting concept. I'm not sure that everybody understands cognitive dissonance, and I don't know that I want to go through to explain it right now either. But yeah, I understand the question. At any rate, I understand that people are looking at this in the face of all of these things. They still deny what's going on and what have you. How can you help people who do that? Well, there's a reason it's called cognitive restructuring is cognitive self-change, right? And that's your answer right there. Because if I don't want to be different, then I'm not going to be different, right? So in order for me to do the cognitive work, then I'm going to have to do that. If I was going to try to help someone sort of work through that I cared about or what have you, I might look at those procedures that lead to change, right? That wants behavior evaluation planning, right? So you say that there's no such thing as COVID-19. It's all made up. It doesn't exist. And we hear that. Let me tell you, at the CCP, we hear that all the time. Okay. So that's certainly out there. So, well, what do you get out of believing that? What do you get out of denying these sorts of things, right? And using that sort of thing. And then with that, do you have any you want to be any different over that, right? you want to be open to that. If they say no, then unfortunately, then no, there's nothing you can do for them. But if they're more open for things like that, maybe some of the social skills, empathy, right? I mean, trying to understand why they think the way they think, why they believe the way they believe. So just being sort of empathetic. Empathy is always your end to anything, right? And that's, in counseling, right? In therapy, that's, empathy is what you want to use because that gets you in other people's quality world. And then they're more, once you're in their quality world, they're more open to listening to what you have to say. So maybe something like that, empathy.
So another question.
But ultimately, if they don't want to change, they're not going to change.
Okay, another question. Why craving for more sweets when stressed? Any quick tips to control the craving?
What happens when we get stressed, whether it's acute stress, or whether it's especially what we're dealing with now with that cumulative stress, that long-term stress, which is chronic stress piled on top of chronic stress, is that affects the cognitive executive functions in the brain. And once again, that sort of stress kicks those functions into a different mode. And so we want to try to put on fat, because the biggest chronic stressor we historically had as human beings was famine, right? I mean, these days, it was an acute stressor that maybe there's a saber-toothed tiger over there, right? But that's just 2 minutes of screaming terror, at the end of which either it's over with or I'm over with, right? But when we're talking about long-term cumulative stress, chronic stress, the biggest one we had historically was famine. So anytime we start to experience that chronic stress, the brain switches over, starts to produce cortisol, that hormone cortisol, and that cortisol causes us to gain weight. It causes us to want to eat chronically and compulsively, and then it wants us to make it eat those sweet food, sugar, right? Bad fats. Okay, good fats are good for you. Fat doesn't make you fat. Sugar makes you fat. But bad fat like bacon, we want to eat bacon. But it's not good for us, but we still like it. It's a comfort food, right? We talk about comfort foods. We want to do those things because it puts on fat, and fat is going to what helps us live through the famine that's coming, right? So if we want to deal with that, then what we've got to do is recognize that we're under stress, engage in the stress management practices and what have you, which includes keeping up with exercise, right? Keeping up an exercise program as I go on. Because another part of that, when that brain kicks over, I don't want to exercise anymore. I may have been doing it before, but I don't want to do it now, okay? Because I want to retain fat. And so just making myself continue with exercise or start exercise, whatever it is what I've got to do.
When the famine hits and they have to triage people that have the biggest need, they can leave me alone for a couple of years. I'll probably make it. So someone's got on here, I like the EFT tap. Is it tapping and other techniques? And
yeah, I think we've covered those before when we went over the cumulative stress stuff. But yeah, those are, especially the EFT. EFT has been used for a lot of different things. There's a lot of research out there on that. Everything from something like grief or anxiety to something like frozen shoulder to, I read an article not too long ago on using tapping to, this was a research article, to deal with blood glucose levels. So this has, I was working with someone recently who had shingles. So definitely they had a lot of pain that was going on. They had never used tapping before. We went through one round of the tapping and it cut their discomfort in half, they said. Wow. during that time. So it can be a very powerful tool to use. And the other ones can be powerful as well. But a lot of research on EFT, a lot of research on mindfulness-based stress reduction as well, or just mindfulness meditation in general, and diaphragmatic breathing. Because we're making, I've worked with a lot of psychiatrists who view something like diaphragmatic breathing as a distraction technique, right? You're just going to focus on the diaphragmatic breathing, so it's going to take your mind off of whatever it is that's causing the emotion of depression or whatever it is. Well, that may be true. It can act as a distraction technique, but when we do diaphragmatic breathing, we are making physiological changes in the body. We're creating those hormones and neurotransmitters, serotonin, melatonin, endorphins, and things like that. We're creating those in our body. We're causing the stimulation to create those as they move through our body. So it's not just a distraction technique. We're making physiological changes in there. So that's why all of my clients, especially if they come to me for stress management, there's two things on their treatment plan. That's diaphragmatic breathing and EFT. Maybe other things, but at least those two will be on there.
Nice. What is the time frame that determines whether or not someone is experiencing unusually long or delayed symptoms of grief?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. This goes back to what I was talking about to begin with, is that, everybody grieves differently, right? So some people get over grief fairly quickly, and some people seems to take quite a while. It may take months, it may take, several months, it may take a year, it may take more than a year, right? Does that mean it's dysfunctional? No, not unless they're stuck in a particular phase of the grief, right? So I would say that it's not so much the time frame that determines. I mean, you can't say you've been grieving too long. You can't say that, right? Or you haven't been grieving long enough. Now, that may be easier to say than that you've been grieving too long, right? You may say, well, I don't think you've grieved quite enough. Your mother died last week and you're over it. I don't know about that. No, you can't really put a time frame on it. It has more to do with not so much the time frame, but how you are dealing with the grief itself. So with pandemic grief, right, we have those 5 characteristics: the suicidality, the apathy, those sorts of things, the meaninglessness, right? All of those sorts of things going on. Those would be more characteristic of sort of a dysfunctional type of grief. but I wouldn't put a time frame on it and say you've been grieving too long. Now, if you've been grieving for a few years, well, maybe if it's intense grief, right? I mean, grief is something that goes on throughout our lives, right? I mean, if I lose somebody that's important to me, I may grieve their death until I die, right? I may grieve their death until I pass away. But it's going to be more intense sort of at the beginning. We're going to sort of those phases, those Kubler-Ross phases of grief, right? And move on out of that. We're still going to miss them. We're still going to, grieve their loss at, particular times of the year and things like that. But yeah, I wouldn't say that I wouldn't put a time frame on it. I would say that would be more the intensity of things like that and the dysfunctionality of it. And when I say dysfunctionality, I mean things like meaninglessness and suicidality and the apathy, these sorts of things that are characteristic of especially pandemic grief. But you can look at 37. There are 37 characteristics for the persistent complex bereavement disorder. So any of those that are
okay. Yeah. Another one came up. When do we need to seek therapy with a pandemic grief?
Whenever you think you need to seek therapy for it, I would say, if you think you need it, then go get it. That's we don't want to hold off on this. This is one of the things, I started out just sort of mentioning the parentally bereaved children and that sort of epidemic that's going on with those kids that have lost their parents and what have you due to COVID-19. One of the things that came out of the research with them is that if you know of a child who this happens and you start to see some sort of problems there, it said do not wait. The longer you wait, the more significant it is, right? So as soon as you see that, send them to get some help so they can address it right then so it doesn't get out of control. I would say the same thing with pandemic grief, right? If you're dealing with pandemic grief and you're having thoughts of suicidality, most certainly seek help, right? Call the suicide helpline, right? The National Suicide Helpline, or whatever you need. If you're having thoughts about, that meaninglessness and what have you, if you find yourself grieving more intensely and you can't get out of it, then talk to somebody, right? There's no shame in talking to somebody. That's what, talk to the CCP, call your local CCP, for Department of State Health Services that, we all have local mental health authorities, behavioral health authorities in your area. Give them a call and seek some help. There's nothing wrong with that, right?
Someone else asked, can a difficult childhood make it hard to cope with a pandemic grief?
It depends on what you mean by a difficult childhood. If you mean that if you're talking about child abuse or something like that, then what we know is that children who are abused tend to have more problems later on as they get older, such as in adolescence, it's usually PTSD, these sorts of things. In adults, it tends to be more depression. So in that case, yes, right, if that's what you mean by difficult childhood, then I'm already prone to becoming more depressed as an adult because of the situation I had from my childhood, right, from being abused in my childhood. So definitely the pandemic grief is only going to make that more intense, is only going to make that worse. So yeah, I would say yes.
Great. Robin.
Thank you, Robin.
Yeah, Robin's great speaker. I'm going to share my screen here just for a minute. I think we've gone through the questions. I just want to go back over the CEU information, if I could, real quick. And let's see if we can get that up. Can you all see that? For those of you that are on to get CEUs, I want to run over this one more time. I know some of you may have joined us just after we did this in the beginning, but we're offering CEUs 1.5 hours of CEU credits for licensed social workers and licensed professional counselors for the state of Texas. We're set up to do it for the state of Texas. Some people have told me they've gotten our certificates and been able to use them in other states, but that is totally up to the state where you're trying to use it, and I have no way of guaranteeing whether they'll take that or not. You must, in order to be eligible for the CEUs, you must have completed this entire live webinar, because we get the report from Zoom for how many minutes that you all have been on. You must complete the 2 surveys. I will send you a post email, a follow-up email. It will have the links to both surveys. One is the Google survey evaluation, which is directly related to the CEUs, and another one is a survey that Dr. Mottern's office puts out, and they need that feedback from you as well. Like I said, both of them will be sent out today after the webinar. The Google survey will be live until 5 p.m. on this Friday, so you'll have up to then to complete it, and then the certificates will be emailed out to you to the email address you put in the survey, not necessarily the one you registered at. The one you put down on the survey is where we're going to mail your certificate to, and it will be mailed out by the end of the day next Friday. Doctor, thank you so much. Just an incredible presentation, great information. I can really see the recording of this just really going crazy just because it's such incredible information today. But thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Marty. There is one question that wants to read. Can I answer that one question in the chat? They wanted to revisit the issue of how to help people who are COVID deniers or conspiracy believers, etc., that later experience pandemic grief. So this is from April. April, this is a thing that I don't have to believe in COVID-19 to experience grief, right? So I don't see how that would, when you're talking about pandemic grief, if you're dealing with somebody with pandemic grief and you want to help them through it, you don't have to mention that it's pandemic grief, right? I mean, it might help to for you to know the characteristics of it, so you can sort of look for those and intervene on those and what have, like the suicidality. If you're seeing other symptoms, you might just suppose that there are symptoms of suicidality, and go from there. But you know, you don't have to talk about it like it's pandemic grief. Just talk about it like it's grief, period. We know that pandemic grief is characterized by certain things, and it tends to be more intense, but just view it as another grieving person, not necessarily that they're grieving because of pandemic, that they're going through pandemic grief, but they're just a grieving person. So help them in that particular way, just as another grieving person.
Somebody asked real quick, how does it relate to cancer patients?
Okay, resiliency, the resiliency part goes along that. As far as cancer patients go, it has nothing to do with pandemic grief that I know of, but I think the question relates to resiliency. Those are the things, especially the energy management stuff, using those techniques to help myself move through there, getting enough sleep, exercise, what have you, diet, those sorts of things. Also the energy management, the tapping, the breathing, all of the stress management stuff are going to be helping people who are going through the stress of cancer, because that's not only a psychological stress, but also a physical stress on the body that we have to go through, even if it, and especially cancer treatment, where through the process of, in many cases, we're putting a person close to death, right? So the cells start to rejuvenate and stuff. So the resiliency training, once again, you don't have to focus on all the parts, right? If they don't have a problem with social skills, then you don't have to focus on the social skills. But the energy stuff, the physical stuff, those would be very important to somebody who's going through cancer, to help them bounce back from that.
Great. We will have this recording out to all of you probably about a week from now. We'll get it posted. You'll get, again, the follow-up email in just a little bit. with the links for the surveys and the links to download the slides. I'll send that out with that as well. And then we have another webinar tomorrow on other brain-related disorders that we have tomorrow at 2 o'clock. For those of you that may not have known about that, I'll have the link to sign up for that in the follow-up email as well. Doctor, thank you so much. I look forward to trying to put together something else with you. This has just been incredible. Thank you. Great job.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us. We surely appreciate it. You all have a wonderful day, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.